Hello, it's Neil Romanic from the Flint, and welcome to the Flint podcast. And I just wanted to do a quick introduction to this to kind of get you up to speed. This had just started out as a regular conversation, and as we got into it, we all thought this is great content that should be on the podcast and that you guys should hear. There was a paper published earlier this year called Geeks versus Climate Change: Understanding American Video Gamers' Engagement with Global Warming. And that was put together by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, which is a great lab that they have over there at Yale where they're studying climate change and how we talk about it, how people understand it, how people don't understand it in the US specifically. And it was really, really cool study they did on gamers and how gamers engage with climate change. And they engage in a really interesting way. So we talked to Jennifer Carman, who is the Deputy Research Manager at the Yale Program on Climate Change, who helped put together the study. And we talked with Marina Psaros, who was Head of Sustainability at Unity when she helped out on this particular study and helped to inform the discussion on this really, really cool examination into gaming and gamers and what they think of climate change. Anyway, I will shut up. I'll let you enjoy the conversation, and thanks for listening, and make sure you subscribe to the Flint newsletter and all our socials. If you want, just start by telling me kind of what you do, and also just maybe talk about the lab there. And Marina, do you want to go first and sort of just talk about your background?
So my background is I used to be the head of Unity Technologies Sustainability. So on my team was all of our corporate sustainability, so our ESG reports and what we were doing around greening of our data centers. That was part of my portfolio. I also led all of our grant making and research agenda for how it was we were going to be using the corporate donor advised fund, and then how we would be supporting creators, so people who are building immersive experiences or video games, anything that was focused around climate change is kind of my purview. And that was actually how I met Jen. I was familiar with the work of the Yale Center before. Most of my career has been spent in climate change, either adaptation or mitigation. And so I was totally familiar with the work of Yale because it's just been at the forefront for, I'm not even sure, 15 years. Jen, you'll know better than me how long yeah, a long time. A lot of my professional career, I've really admired the work that's been done there. And so when I was thinking about video gamers and how they often have like kind of a bad rap, people assume that most people who play video games are, young men playing first-person shooters who, don't care about the world and take a really dim view on life. And that's not actually true. And because I had thought a lot about who plays games and how we can activate people on climate change, I thought, gosh, I wonder if we could use the work that Yale has pioneered in this space, this longitudinal study of what Americans think about climate change, and actually apply that to gamers and do a little bit of a compare and contrast. How does like the average gamer compare against the average American when it comes to their attitudes and beliefs about climate change?
Let's go. Okay, so maybe Jennifer, you tell me about the lab. I should have asked you first. So.
Yeah, so my name is Jennifer Carman. I am the Deputy Research Manager and the Deputy Director of Survey Research at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And we study American and international public opinion, beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behavior related to all things climate change. And so, but we also study messaging interventions and ways to prompt action. We also work with a partnerships team that engages with organizations all over the US and around the world, translating our findings into actionable steps that people can, that organizers and practitioners can use to promote climate action. We also have a radio show actually called Yale Climate Connections that tells stories of climate action in the real world. And that's broadcast in, I'm trying to remember. It's somewhere around 750 broadcast stations across the US. It reaches a lot of people. And so I'm part of the survey research team. So I do work collecting data on public opinion and attitudes related to climate change. And I'm part of the study, the Climate Change in the American Mind study, which Marina mentioned. It's been running in partnership with the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. It's been running since 2008. I feel because I'm a survey nerd, I have to be a little technical. And I'm like, it's not technically a longitudinal study. It's something that is, but we have been collecting data continuously.
So what is a longitudinal study for those of us who aren't?
A longitudinal study, the difference is that it's the same group of people collected over, like you collect data from them over and over again over a long period of time. And this study isn't that. It's like different groups of people. And there are a few people who have like taken it multiple times over time, and we can track some of their changes, but that's like this is a relatively small percentage of respondents overall. So it's more like this group of people at one time, and then another group of people 6 months later, and then another group of people 6 months later. And so it still is giving you a representative sample of the US over time, but it's not the same, it's not tracking the same group of people over time. That's so.
Right. So it's not tracking behavior change in those particular individuals.
That's correct. Although then I have to like add a correction to my correction because this is what you learn to do when you get a PhD in something. We just had a paper that was published in like the last week on tracking people's changes in attitudes among that small subsample of people who just happen to have taken it multiple times over the years. There's a little bit of longitudinal data in there, but it's not, it's not like systematically, like entirely designed that way. It's just a happy coincidence.
And so you're looking at like the national studies, but do you look at populations like sort of gamers or beer drinkers or people who like race cars? Do you break things down into other types of subgroups like that, or have they mostly been kind of national type studies?
Mostly we've looked at national studies. We also do international studies. And the biggest one that we do is like political breakdowns, is political ideology, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. I'm trying to, and we've done various other demographic analyses. We also, I almost hesitate to say the other group that we've done because I don't want to, like, it's people of faith. Like we've looked into like religious groups, which is not like, I mean, depending on how nerdy someone is, maybe you can make the connection, but it's like, that's the only other kind of people who are interested in something that we've really studied in a lot of depth.
That actually would be really interesting because that would be...
and there is like getting into like the faith practices of gamers and all of that. That's like its own, but its own discussion. But the video gamer study was something that we haven't done deep dives into particular like interest groups, like affinity groups this way, like we have with the gamers. So this was something that Marina really brought to us and like inspired us to do.
So Marina, you were like, I just want to know what gamers are thinking, or kind of what was the impetus for this?
Well, so as I mentioned, I have a background in climate change adaptation planning. So I've spent a lot of my professional career in front of groups of people who are not necessarily, like climate voters or climate engaged. And in all of my experiences, there's been a bit of a problem explaining a lot of the science of climate change to people who aren't really, who aren't like a coastal geomorphologist or someone who's an expert. And it's been really troublesome, and it's gotten even more so. So as climate impacts have increased, and as we've all, as awareness of the issues have increased as well, and people really start seeing the impacts, I think a lot of people feel sort of shut out of a conversation about what can be done about climate change. And a lot of the things that can be done are at the local level. It's how you vote in local and national elections. It's, the things you do in your community. It's the brands you support or don't, right? So there's all these ways to get involved that people have not historically been very aware of. And as I was doing, a lot of this work over the past, couple of decades, I've also looked at the way that information is conveyed in the popular media and in entertainment. And I think, games can be a really powerful medium to convey, the message, whatever that message is. It can be around climate change. It can be around lots of cultural things. All of the forms of entertainment that we have are really, really powerful ways to normalize new behavior, to help people imagine new worlds or practices that we want to build. And games are actually, even in my mind, better than most forms of entertainment for this, because they are unique in that players are at the center of their own experience, and they have the ability to shape and change the narrative, right? So gamers have a sense of their own agency when they're playing a game, when they're engaged in that form of entertainment. And it's like, it is actually that agency, which is why a lot of people play games. We like to be able to experiment and to learn and to make choices and see what happens when we make those choices. So thinking about what are the opportunities of games as a entertainment, vehicle to get people more aware of and even engaged on climate change. That was kind of the big vision. And then when I started talking to people about that, I got a lot of folks saying like, oh, well, aren't gamers mostly like 15-year-old boys, like, playing a first-person shooter in their basement? And I realized there was actually a lot of like myth busting that needed to happen around who gamers were in order to see what sort of potential games have as a way to communicate about, educate about, and ultimately get people engaged in and active on climate change.
That's really, I mean, to sort of
talk
about my own experience with that, but it really rings a lot, because I first learned about climate change from my dad in the 1980s. So way back then, my dad was an ROTC teacher and taught aerospace, and knew his science,
Cool.
and so kind of he told me about CO2 and stuff, and I was like, oh, okay, that could be a thing. But I actually understood it viscerally from playing Sim Earth. I don't know if you remember Sim Earth.
I do. Yeah,
But it was just
absolutely.
like when you're playing Sim Earth, it was like just that the carbon dioxide got a little out of whack and your whole planet melted down. And it was and it really was this sense of like, oh, there's like kind of 1% to and just seeing this relatively tiny percentage destroying your whole planet,
Yeah. And
it was just
I used to
playing
work.
that I really got that. I got that.
Yeah, and it's so different. I mean, like you said, it's visceral. I worked for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for a long time. And it was there when I would really like watch people's eyes roll into the back of their heads or just get up and leave, because the way that climate change was communicated at that time and for so many years was, like I said, really expert driven. And you required a lot of knowledge to be able to even really understand what was being talked about. And then in the US, one of the biggest problems I see with that approach is that how we adapt to climate change totally depends on how voters vote in local elections, right? So if you think about whether or not a seawall is going to get built, or whether or not you'll have some sort of nature-based solution in an area. These are all decisions made by the local voters, right? Like local people have a lot of control over how our communities look. And so with great power comes great responsibility, and often some at least basic need to want to engage and to be knowledgeable about what you're engaging on. And I had actually worked with the county of Marin in, I think it was maybe, 2010 or 11, on sea level rise planning in local communities in California coast. And one of the things that the county of Marin did, and that I got to be a part of, was the development of a game called the Game of Floods. And that game, people pretend that they are a planning commission. It's a tabletop game, so not a video game, but a tabletop game where people get a certain amount of money, and they have a mission to try and protect as much of a community as possible, and they've got long range planning. And so instead of just a bunch of planners and experts up at the front of a room talking at a group of people about catastrophe that was coming and everything that needed to be done. We had people take on the part of players themselves and be able to like learn for themselves and manage their own information intake. And it just led to such better outcomes for the people involved. They were more engaged. They had seemed to have a better understanding of what was at stake. And it was really through that experience that I started thinking about how we could use a more playful approach to do simulations and to identify new solutions and to also engage a broader community of people in these decisions. Maybe some people who don't feel comfortable coming to a government-run meeting in the middle of a day, or people who don't feel like they have the advanced expert language to access a conversation, right? So how do we open that up and make it more real and less scary to everyday people?
And it seems like that encourages that kind of agency you're talking about too, where you're practicing, like I did some stuff and it had this effect, in the game, at least, I took these actions or I used my climate bucks or whatever, to create an outcome, and you kind of practice that doing something and having a result.
Exactly. And I'm assuming you remember also from Sim Earth, you probably played that game a second time after your incredible disappointment and disbelief that you had just melted down your whole planet, right?
Yeah.
You probably got very curious about why that happened and wanted to rerun it.
Well, and that's the thing too. I think we can get into that more, kind of how gamers think and how that, that problem solving thing went. Jennifer, again.
Oh, well, I just wanted to ask Marina, did you say that you've worked on developing Game of Floods?
Yes, I was a very small part of, running it and testing it with mostly high school groups and in community meetings. But yeah.
That's so funny because I played that game in grad school.
Wow, that makes me feel very old. But also really, did you like it? What did you think of Game of Floods?
I did. Yeah, I played it in my adaptation class. It was really fun. It's great for classrooms. It's like for learning about adaptation and adaptation decision making. So yeah.
I actually loved playing it in classrooms because I think at that time I'd already been working in climate change adaptation for a couple of years, and I was really familiar with the educational resources that were out there. And it's still my beef, is I feel like we do an amazing job now of educating youth about potential climate impacts and an absolutely terrible job about telling them what they can do. And so we now have this incredibly literate and very aware and very depressed group of young people. And Game of Floods, I feel like, was a way to move that a little bit, because what we did actually was we wrote a grant to the state of California, and we had young people play Game of Floods, and then we had them go out and do some citizen science in their own communities to look at what was at risk from sea level rise in the areas that they knew. And then we actually had them, Jen, you'll love this, we had them go out and do a little bit of social science, doing surveys with the people in their communities about, whose basically fault they thought it was and who they thought needed to take some sort of action, if they'd had any personal experiences with climate change impacts. And it wound up being this incredible data source because it was, students in California. And so a lot of them were from newcomer communities. And so when we asked them to go out and do this survey, which wasn't particularly scientifically rigorous, it wasn't like what you guys are doing at Yale, but it was a way for students to talk to their own communities about this. They all had a Google form, and, they were given the protocol, asked these questions to whatever, 5 to 20 people, depending on how serious the teacher was about the level of homework. The students would be going and asking, a certain number of people in their community. And then what these students wound up doing was, they would ask, their mom or their grandpa or whoever. And so the study itself was in English, and they would often translate into Tagalog or Vietnamese or Spanish and all these languages that we did not have access to because it was a government agency. And again, often people don't feel comfortable talking to government agencies, or they don't have time to show up at the time that most public meetings are being held. So we got all this data back, and it wound up just being this incredible rich source of information. And we had students actually then collate the data themselves, along with the research that they'd been gathering, pictures of things that had been flooded and things that were at risk of flood. And we had them actually do presentations to their local boards, like planning boards and commission meetings, about what they were feeling. And it was a really powerful experience for those young people. Instead of to have been told, your world's on fire, we're all going to die, for them to instead go out and take a look, talk to their community, and then go in and talk to the adults who were making decisions about what they thought should be done.
That's
So,
really interesting. And yeah, I mean,
okay.
and it's again that thing of games as action or games as activity, where it's like you're saying that cliche of like, oh, it's a 15-year-old sitting in the basement doing nothing, is kind of is sort of that this weird cliche we have. But there's
Yeah.
that thing about no, actually that there's deep engagement, in a way, or a sense of sort of seeking activity at least, or seeking control, I think, rather than just sort of like
Yeah.
passively absorbing information.
And I think that you can, I mean, for me, the ultimate is to take it a step further and empower people who are playing games to take whatever kind of action they want. I'm sure you've seen citizen science apps like iNaturalist, where you can go and actually contribute to scientific data collection. There was a very cool one called Ahika Rangers that would give you like a mission in game, and then you would go out and do a real world activity, and then you would go back into the game, like upload your data, which was then used by I think it was researchers in New Zealand around some sort of endangered species counts, and then they would get a reward in game. And so that kind of stitching together of the digital world with the physical world, I think, is also something that we're just at the beginning of seeing. There's a couple of studios and groups who are looking at how we can actually do more of that and empower people to make better decisions and get the kind of rewards they want. Your infinite sword of greenness in game for having gone and done something in the real world. And that's what I think is really cool, because I have two kids who have a much more nuanced understanding of their digital and real world selves than I do, but they, they have more identity with their avatars in games, and they think about their in-game activities, and it's very natural for them to kind of go in between what I think of as the real world, so the physical world, and their in-game world, and in ways that it's not natural to me just because of, how I grew up, but it is to them. And I think about ways that we can move beyond just like, oh, sign a petition, or taking like a really low level, low risk, low impact activity in game, to how do we actually get people to do something more beyond sign a digital petition? How do we get you to like show up at a meeting or provide data that's going to be used in a certain planning process, or, real world action that will make some sort of difference.
I think there's that. I mean, these sort of these tropes or cliches are kind of things that we just assume that, people say, well, people aren't interested in all the numbers of, it's climate change and it's numbers and it's facts and it's data, but people love to geek out over data. If it's baseball stats, people like spend hours and hours thinking about that stuff. So I think it's like the right set of data in front of the right people, and people can really get their teeth into that. So maybe can we talk about like what the actual findings of the, what kind of the outcome of the studies was in terms of what kind of attitudes did you see, and what kind of surprises were there?
Yeah, I wanted to just add one quick thing to what you just said, because I think the geeking out about data is also a matter of making sense of that data, right? Of like making it clear in a way like to you. Because I think that one of the things in my own experience with gaming that is like people do tend to geek out over the stats of their games, but it has to be translated to them, within the world of their game too. So, but to recap some of the findings from this study, so we conducted two studies, actually. First was part of our nationally representative study called Climate Change in the American Mind. We collected data from about 1,000 people across the US. We asked one question, how often do you play video games? Never, I think, a few times a month, about once a month, or once every few months, about once a month, like the just never or up to like multiple times a day.
Mhm. And
And
were those, sorry to interrupt, were
yeah,
that video games, was that defined in any way, or could that be
no, it
Wordle
was just
or
video games. So
okay.
how often do you play video games? And
Mhm.
so and it was about half of our sample. It was split almost evenly in half between people who said never and people who said anywhere between, once every few weeks up to multiple times per day. And so the first test was just looking to see on that one measure, are people who play video games different from people who don't? And so we found some demographic differences, like people who do play video games are younger, but people across all ages do play them. We also found some really interesting differences by gender. Like there's a very large generational divide, especially with gender, with regard to video gaming, at least in the study that we did. We found that, like, I think among Gen X women, like 1/3 of women play video games, but among millennial women, it was 2/3 of women who play video games. So,
Mhm.
and then, which is also about the same for like Gen Z women. And so, like, you see that big divide that happens there. But then we looked at differences, controlling for those age differences, controlling for those gender differences. Are people who play video games more likely to talk about global warming with their friends and family? Are they more likely to be willing to engage in consumer activism, which means like buying products from people who take action, from companies that are taking action, or not buying products from companies that are opposing action? So those were two of, talking about it, consumer activism, but also willingness to engage in political action, things like writing to your elected officials, signing petitions, donating, volunteering. And we found that for engagement in consumer activism in particular, but also engagement in political action, there was a slight positive effect of playing video games, of like being a person who plays video games on these. So what that means is that people who play video games are slightly more likely to engage in consumer activism and be willing to engage in these political actions. So once we had that information, we conducted a follow-up study that was just focused on people who play video games. And that was also from a representative sample of video gamers in the US and from a sample of about 2,000 people. And so on that one, we were able to ask a lot more questions in depth about how they engage with climate change through games, and what kinds of games do they play, and what kinds of gaming resources do they follow. So and we also looked at sort of gaming characteristics that are associated with those same behaviors, with talking about climate change, with engagement in consumer activism, and with willingness to engage in political activism. And we looked at a whole bunch and we did some exploratory analyses, and we focused on 3 characteristics of video gamers that might be associated. One was being motivated to play games. So like wanting to engage with people, wanting to accomplish things within games. So that was one. The second was whether you've actually heard of climate change content in a video game. And the third was how many of your friends and family play games as a proportion. Is it none of your friends and family up to everybody? And so we found that like it gets kind of like technical in terms of like what these relationships are and which ones relate to which variables. But basically, we found that all 3 of those have some relationships with these, have positive relationships with these outcomes. So in other words, people who are more engaged with video games, who are more motivated to play video games, are also slightly, not overwhelmingly, but slightly more likely to engage in these behaviors. And so and another thing that we also found as part of that study was 22% of people in our sample said that they had heard, that they'd seen or heard of content related to global warming through gaming in the past year, either through a stream or through a game content itself, which we found very surprising. I think when we wrote the question, we were like, well, this will be like a baseline question. 3% of people will say yes. So we asked no follow-ups on that question. And then when we found out that almost a quarter of our sample had seen something, we're like, no, we don't know. We don't know how. We don't know. Like, so it's something we'd love to know more about how people are engaging.
So
through
That could be,
games.
you're
But
saying like a stream, like they could be watching somebody on Twitch or something as well in that. Was that
yeah,
right?
exactly. So like through watching like a stream, like somebody mentions climate change in some way. And so what we found is that, so what's interesting in what we found is like this engaging with games has this positive relationship with engagement in behavior related, like with political behavior, but also this like social dimension, right, of having more people, having more friends and family who play games is positively associated with consumer behavior and talking about climate change. So that suggests that people who have more friends and family who play games are more likely to engage in some of these political behaviors, which also
Hmm.
goes against this idea of like the isolated video gamer, right, as well.
Totally. Yeah.
And so because video gamers are part of communities, that like the video gaming community is like a very notable part of video gaming identity, and so that is also part of this willingness to engage in action. And I should always add the caveat that this isn't overwhelming. Like it's not like that video gamers are leaving everyone else in the dust, but
Mhm.
getting to the idea, there is that they are willing, and I think that and as we've been talking about, that willingness is underrated, and there's a lot more that can be done to activate them. But also, yeah, that, let's see, what was my other point that I was going to make there? I don't remember.
Open-ended.
Just that it's not negative, that there's not this yeah, but there is not a negative relationship either. They're not less likely to engage in these behaviors, and I think that
Yeah.
that's important. Like especially because, as you were saying at the beginning, the assumption is that they are. And the third point that I wanted to make there is that statistically speaking, this is like once you control for all of these other potentially confounding variables, things like age, things like political affiliation, those were all things that we controlled for in our analysis. So we could isolate this relationship between playing video games and video gaming engagement and these outcomes.
Hmm. So are you looking for like, is there another stage to that, or are you looking at doing any more studies or digging deeper in that?
We aren't right now. I know that there is a lot of work there's a huge body of work that's happening in the gaming industry, and one of the things that I've learned from doing this research is that there are a lot of academics who are studying this, and a lot of them are studying it from the angle of like characteristics of games, like how should we design a game that engages people. But what I hope that this research contributes is helping them identify audiences that are more engageable as well.
Mm-hmm. There's uh I mean, I'm really interested in the idea of, like I was saying, people geeking out about stats, and that that where, I mean, I like real-time strategy games, RTS games, but that's like the whole thing, that's a whole planet
Yeah.
right now is like this big RTS game, and you've got to move resources around in these wacky, crazy, creative ways to stay below these certain numbers, and it seems like that there's that just seems right for harnessing the way gamers, diehard gamers work and think to kind of in ways that, if I'm just to get my stuff from the news, I'm not going to be thinking that way. But if you're already prone to like, okay, I understand this complex sort of system and I've got to try to manage it and get these numbers down, that there's
Yeah.
something already primed there.
I think so, because the other point that I make in the paper is that while this study, what's the word, undermines, I guess, or contradicts some of our stereotypes about video gamers, it also contradicts some of our stereotypes about environmentalists, because I think that one of the things that I've found when talking about this is discovering all of the environmentalists who are like, who feel the way that you do, of just kind of like geeking out in this way, but also are geeky about video games. Like there is that sort of that approach to thinking that is very compatible with playing video games. I think I've like learned a lot about like which of my coworkers play video games, and they've all been very excited in learning about this study. And I think that that's been one of the things that for me about doing this research has been a cool thing, is to kind of see that coming out of the woodwork of like this other stereotype that, if you're going to be an environmentalist, you need to like live in trees and hate everything that everybody likes, and that doesn't have to be like that. That's not who environmentalists are realistically. Like, we do like geeking out, we do like playing video games, and I hope that this work also surfaces that.
I wonder, maybe it's a question for Marina as well, that and thinking about like Unity and your background there too. Like, what do you suppose the awareness is? I mean, I know there's, people are working on it now, but how just the footprint of games and creating games and stuff you're doing in the cloud and stuff that's sitting on servers and all that stuff, what about the environmental impact of game production and game playing itself? Is there, I guess, awareness among, and is there industry awareness and then awareness, or at least questioning of it among gamers too?
Yeah, well, actually, one of the interesting findings from the study, and Jen, correct me if I wind up getting this wrong or off, but I think it was over half and maybe closer to 60% of gamers actually think that the gaming industry has a responsibility to act. And I thought that was interesting because that to me meant that, they're sophisticated consumers of games as well as everything else, right? Like, consumers are aware now of the footprint that the stuff they use has. And that was really an interesting piece of data that came out of that from that study, I think. And then it was also really wonderful cover for some of the other work I was doing at Unity, which was to think about what are the things that we can do to lower our footprint. There's actually been some great work in the gaming industry on this to look at, for example, how many resources are being consumed if it's just on like a load screen. You don't have to have the highest fidelity on a menu screen because whatever, someone's just going to get through there and actually play their game. So like, what are the invisible to the gamer tweaks that can be made to lower electricity consumption? What are the really big wins that we can do, like, inter VPPA, virtual power purchase agreements, and other kinds of power purchase agreements to make sure that the energy being consumed either in the data center or even on closer to the edge, closer to the device of the player, that energy being consumed is clean energy. And I think that corporations have a lot of power here to do better things with their data centers. And as games move also more and more into cloud, from being like a physical disk that you would purchase to being delivered through the cloud, that will become more and more important. It's exciting because if you were to look at like a life cycle analysis of what's the whole environmental footprint of a game, that in the cloud looks different than it did when it was on a disk that was just delivered to a consumer. And so on the cloud, cloud-based games, it's actually a lot easier to figure out your footprint and to clean it up because, like I said, it's virtual power purchase agreements, it's, building real new capacity for the grid. And talking about, as we were saying, data and nerdiness, that is absolutely a problem that there are a lot of nerds and a lot of gaming companies are eager and equipped to solve, which is figuring out how much electricity am I using in the generation of the game. But then more and more, there's also, with newer games, they'll have like seasons and more frequent updates and downloadable content, DLCs. And so all of that is just done from, a cloud service onto a console or a phone or whatever. And that means that we can have more frequent updates to games, which is great. And it also means, again, that we have the opportunity to not be shipping physical disks around and to do it in a clean cloud environment.
But I guess that's also, we do work with an organization called Greening of Streaming, which is working on video delivery. And the questions that they've been working on are kind of some of these same questions, but with gaming, you're also talking about potentially, especially cloud gaming, even bigger files and even more data you're trying to move back and forth. So they've been kind of looking at some of that, and it'd be interesting to kind of get those guys hooked up with some of the gaming community, because it sounds like they're working on similar problems, but again, maybe in kind of different silos.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. There's an effort also by, I can't remember the name of the company right now. I believe they're called actually just simply Scope 3. And they're focused on looking at the environmental footprint, actually specifically the energy footprint of digital advertising. Because, advertising, you wouldn't think about it, immediately, but it actually is like it's like a real-time service that's being offered, and there's a whole bunch of data being swapped around, and all of that information has to live somewhere. So it's almost like making visible all these things that we think are really small parts of a footprint, but they do add up. And I love to see innovation in like streaming and advertising and all of the different parts of this ecosystem, because I feel like, 5 years ago, we had everyone saying, oh, that's not my problem. Oh, those aren't my emissions. I don't need to offset it or get renewable energy credits for it or diminish it. And now everyone is actually looking at like, let's look at the entire value chain of a video game and see, all right, if it's mostly downloadable content, then, and there's also advertising in it, then we have to kind of like figure out which of these pieces of the pie belong to whom. And then instead of just, buying cheap carbon offsets, it's actually what are the potential emissions reductions in this category? What can we actually do to, make this better and not just greenwash? And I love to see more action in those areas. I can send you another report that we published about a year after this work with Yale, which was looking at exactly that. If you look at how a video game is made, its whole life cycle from, whenever it's being created by an indie developer, let's just say, and then it's published, and then it's in the cloud, and then how do you end of life it? This is going to get a little bit weedy. The greenhouse gas protocol, GHG protocol, which is, the international standards for how to do this kind of accounting of who's responsible for what emissions. That was written before we were in the situation that we are now. So it's kind of missing some really specific guidance to the ICT sector on who should take responsibility for which part of these scope 3 emissions. So we actually had a bag of cats herding process on that the Carbon Trust did with a bunch of the folks in the video games industry to kind of try and figure out how we were each doing our emissions accounting and where there might be overlaps and where there were holes. And I think that every industry is going to need to start doing that kind of deep, uncomfortable dive where you just get real transparent, because otherwise, it's, I think, why there's been a lot of greenwashing and why it continues is people aren't taking a very close, careful look at an industry-wide level.
And there's nuances of like, moving things to the cloud is great sometimes, but not all of them. Is it, are disks worse or better than, I download a new version of my game, every time there's an update, I download the whole thing, or, whatever it is. There's like we have to, I guess that's again part of this geeking out or having to cope with
exactly
all these real numbers, is going like, what exactly is going on here, rather than what I figure is probably going on here.
Yeah, and you think about like backwards compatibility of devices. It's way better to leave your clunky, slow, I don't know, PlayStation 3 or Quest headset or whatever it is in service longer, so that you don't have to go get new, rare earth minerals and build new devices. And the idea, I don't know if you guys followed, but a couple of years ago, the Right to Repair Act was actually approved in the US. And I think there was something similar in Europe, which basically says that we should be able to, use our devices longer, repair them ourselves. And I was so excited to see that, because this like planned obsolescence of hardware is a nightmare from an environmental perspective.
Absolutely. I've kept you here for about an hour, and it's been amazing, and I have a lot more questions, but we should probably call it quits for now. But it'd be great to follow up with you and kind of just keep abreast of the work you're doing. I think that's a really exciting topic, and just I think there's, in thinking about games and gamers and how the industry works and how the audience for games works, I just think there's so much potential there that is still untapped.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Thank you.